The Open University's Contemporary Cultures of Writing Research Group is absolutely delighted to have been partnering with MK Lit Fest on this series, the long and short of it, from flash fiction to the doorstop novel. Each of our online events has been hosted and chaired by one of our PhD students or recent graduates, and film clips will be included in our new advanced creative writing course for undergraduates. You can find out more about the OU's creative writing provision on our website, and Dave will be posting links in the chat in due course. Please do use the chat yourself to post questions. Don't wait until we move to the question and answer from the floor at the end, because otherwise we'll have a mad rush and won't be able to fit you all in. So as soon as a question pops into your mind, stick it in the chat. I'll be collating them and I will put them to our guest, Amit Chaudhuri, when we reach that part of the session. If the chat is inaccessible to you, then once we do get to the chat part, to the Q&A part, please just use the raise your hand function and I will call on you then. You can enable captions if that helps you too. So tonight's session will focus on the novel, the most ubiquitous perhaps of literary forms, but one that can be really quite tricky to pin down. What exactly is a novel, we might ask, and what might a novel be? So some interesting questions to chew over, and on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rebekah.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you, Dave, both for your introductions. And hello, lovely audience. Welcome to the fourth and final in the series of the Open University sponsored discussions on fictional forms, the long and the short of it. Tonight, we'll be looking at the novel in conversation with world-renowned author and musician Amit Chaudhuri. My name's Rebekah Lattin-Rawstrone, and I'm a creative writing PhD student at the Open University, writing a novel about British traveller, explorer, and political officer Gertrude Bell. And I couldn't be more excited to introduce you to Amit Chaudhuri, who joins us from India this evening. Thank you, Amit. Amit is a prize-winning author of 8 novels, the latest of which, Sojourn, came out last year. His fiction has won numerous awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the Government of India's Sahitya Akademi Award. He's also a poet, a musician, an academic, and a writer of non-fiction. His most recent album, Across the Universe, was released last year, and his most recent non-fiction work, Finding the Raga, about Indian classical music, received the James Tate Black Prize in 2022. We'll be talking about that most popular of forms, the novel. What can it encompass and how it is influenced with particular reference to Amit's fantastic body of work. So welcome, Amit.
Thank you.
I was wanting to start off with influences. As a musician and a huge fan of Indian classical music, how would you say that the structure of your novels has been influenced by the improvisational and poetic aspects of Indian music?
You know, I mean, this is something that I had no consciousness of in terms of, you know, borrowing from Indian music or being consciously influenced by Indian music. By Indian music, let me specify or narrow it down further. North Indian classical music and a particular form which I began to kind of learn in 1978 when I was 16, called the Khayal, which means it's an Arabic word imported into Indian languages, and it means the imagination. It could mean fancy. It could mean, you know, a thought, a whim, even. It's a fascinating genre, and I'll come back to it. But yeah, I mean, I've thought about it for a very long time in terms of what could possibly be common to me as a, you know, between the musician in me and the writer in me. I've had to work this out. I've also found it fascinating that on a conscious level, I'm not aware of being a singer when I write. I'm not aware of being a writer when I sing. It's possible to kind of inhabit separate selves, um, and you know, forget other selves that you otherwise inhabit at other points in your life or even the day. So that is fascinating for me as well, because it sort of complicates this somewhat comfortable syncretic idea that, you know, things coexist in the creative person in a conscious and happy sort of coexistence. And that the creative person is someone who manages these different forms of creativity, and you know, manages them fairly well. So it's a kind of model which actually doesn't work, because uh, if you're creative in more than one sort of genre or form or thing, you are not aware of the other selves which practice other sort of, you know, take part in these other experiences of different forms. Having said that, having emphasized that, I find this disconnection uh, instructive and illuminating and puzzling and something to think about when we can kind of try to construct what creativity might be, or what sort of a so-called multifaceted creativity might be. Even the word multifaceted kind of implies a unity which isn't actually there. So having said that, that it's important to take that on board. I would also say that, having scarred my brain over the years for the continuities, one of them is that I like to listen. As a musician, I like to listen. As a writer, I like to listen. So what does listening imply? Listening implies being not completely centered in yourself, and being distracted by things often which you can't see. And this is very true, especially of life in India, where you are always on some level hearing something in the background, listening to something, even if you aren't actively listening to it. Some part of you is decentered and listening to what's happening on another street, or in another apartment or flat near you, in a house. You can't see the source of the sound, and you are from moment to moment kind of linked to those, through those sounds, to something else which is impacting on your life, without you sort of having fully given it a sort of fully fleshed outline. And this kind of the, the this ability to be not only happy, but to live with a horizon in which everything in it isn't sort of fleshed out. That a lot of what has meaning for you is suggestive and invisible. That's important, I think, and it's important to me, both as a writer and a musician, as a composer of music as well. The other thing I would say, and would be the last bit of my long kind of rumination on your question, and the last thing I would say, finally, I think I do have I've spotted something that I gravitate towards as a practitioner, that's common to both khayal and to writing, and that is the act of deferral in khayal. The act of deferral, by which I mean, the raga is a cluster of notes that goes up and down the octave, in a distinctive way. So each two ragas, three ragas, five or six ragas might have identical notes, but you identify a raga because of the particular clusters of notes and the way in which they are related to each other as you go from the lower tonic to the upper tonic of the octave and then come down again. So there are some notes which will be omitted on, let's say, on the way up, or included on the way up, which aren't on the way down. Some notes might be included on the way down, which are omitted on the way up. So there are elisions on the way up and down and additions on the way up and down, which characterize this kind of this progression that I'm talking about as the singer is or the person who's performing is making their way through and elaborating on and expanding the raga, which is after all just a kind of outline of those clusters. But it's coming into being through these kind of elaborations, which observe the elisions and the additions, which characterize the ascent and the descent, and through that not only create the rag, but create the multiple perspectives on those notes that the rag is made up of. So I'll circle around those notes. I know you're expecting those notes. I'll sing them, but I will come to them in a roundabout way. Now, I think this is something I'm drawn to as a writer as well. Very early on, I mean, in my first novel, A Strange and Sublime Address, where I describe a walk during a power cut, and then the narrator points out that somebody was going to say, the reader would say, "Come to the point," and the point was actually the loitering that the walk included or involved, and the distractions that the walk during the power cut, where the houses that the boy was watching were dimly lit, but each one of them was different. Something slightly different was going on in them. That was the point, but the actual story would never be told. I mean, I think that the paragraph lays out that as the kind of way of reading that novel. And now I see that I was always drawn to this avoidance of coming to the point. And for me, as in the khayal and elaboration in khayal, which is, and that's what's called improvisation. Deferral is called improvisation. In when we talk about Indian music, it's nothing but deferral. That is what for me constitutes beauty. So that is the beautiful.
Yeah, that's so wonderful to hear. And I think you picked up on so many aspects of your work that really resonate with me. And there's one quote I think you gave in Finding the Raga about having a conversation over dinner with some other academics about films that you like that just took a long time to get to the point and the beginning stretching out. And also I love this idea of listening, observing, and improvisation. And I think it seems to me that this is partly you really carefully embracing what it feels like to actually live, the lived experience.
Mm.
And particularly characters, I'm thinking of Nirmalia in The Immortals. His kind of inner life is much more important in a way to you, I think, than the drama of the big events. And I wonder whether this approach to writing also affects the way that you write character, do you think?
I mean, when you say inner life, and people would immediately think of thoughts, psychology, I think of a sort of, I think that's there, but also a sort of a series of sensations, of bits, fragments of memory, which don't necessarily have to do with important things. I think the constant sort of encounter with the inconsequential that our lives are largely made up of is of great importance to me, maybe of greater importance than building up character as something that comprises, the psychology of a person. Um, to, I mean, I don't arrive at character by creating a person physically and then pouring character in, I mean, psychology into that, into that physical sort of, receptacle. It's this kind of encounter with the everyday that creates the novel for me, and then creates characters in novels as well, I suppose. Yeah. I'm trying to think, because my novels started out as a rebellion against interiority. I mean, rebellion, by rebellion, I mean rebellion against my own sort of preoccupations with interiority as a young man, as a teenager. And when I grew up, when I was growing up in the 70s, there was a word called existentialism, which was doing the rounds, and it spoke to teenagers, I think, as well. Because every teenager is an existentialist, or at least used to be. They maybe no longer, but so you'd see everything through the sort of gaze of interiority, with where sort of your path in the world was defined by various sort of ideas about the human being's sort of role and path in the world, existentialism being only the most recent among them at that point of time. So there was existentialism, there was another word called absurd. All of that would sort of underline the fact of yourself and your path in the world, which at that time was kind of said to be by those French philosophers to be to the teenager who misunderstood them to be absurd and laden with the weight, the absurd weight of existence. All of which meant you didn't notice the street. You didn't notice the physical. You were almost leading a metaphysical existence. You saw things metaphysically. I would even because Beckett had enough stuff in his work which lent itself to an absurdist interpretation. I would only see man and the absurd destiny of man when I watched a Beckett play, or when I kind of read a book by Beckett, the absurd destiny of the human being, reading Malone Dies. Only later would I begin to notice the humor, begin to notice the physicality. With Kafka, it's the same thing with Kafka, that again, the absurd destiny of man, the existential fate of man, whether the man becomes an insect or not, whoever that man might be. And then later on, I would notice Kafka tells us what Gregor was eating after he lost his appetite, what kind of rekindled his appetite. It took his sister to think, well, he isn't eating anymore, so I must give him different stuff from the kind of food I usually give him. And then she takes out chicken bones with the white sauce still congealed on them, some other rotting fruit, and, as the narrator says, a piece of cheese which Gregor only the previous week had said was unfit for human consumption. Now, that's funny and that's specific, and that is inconsequential, but of great consequence at that moment, but of great beauty as well. Now, when I read Kafka as if it were all, the play of absurdity, or the play of the absurd destiny of man, I didn't notice that list at all. I was so preoccupied with this metaphysical allegory. So I would say that I had to chuck that out. I had to chuck out this interiority. I had to move towards the physical. I had to move away from the human being as being the central preoccupation of the novelist or the writer, into the entire field that comprises the world in which the human being is just one element. And that entire field is of importance. And that entire field is transformed for the novelist. So that was, so I had to sort of admit to not understanding what character was in any conventional sense, because I was interested in this entire transformed field that included not just the human being and their thoughts, but objects that were not necessarily aware of being a part of that human being's life, and even space and emptiness.
I think that's a really beautiful description that ties back around again to that idea of, really living experience, that sense of, I think some of the really beautiful passages in your work to me are the moments when you have, you're observing things like, the mother drinking a cup of tea and remembering that and thinking of afternoon raga, and or being, in fact, actually exploring playing as a musician and playing the raga and being in a kind of world that is sort of somehow a different world. And I wonder, as well as all of these things, so we're talking about music, we're talking about philosophy, there's a lot of things that the novel can take, I think, that perhaps some other forms can't. Do you think? That's one of the things I love about the novel, is you can just include so much in it. What do you think that the novel can be for you? If you're thinking, what is the novel? Are you able to kind of give it a definition for you?
I have tried again and again to define this thing because, firstly, because I was never comfortable with the novel as a form. And I guess I wasn't comfortable with the realist novel as a form. I wasn't comfortable with inventing stories about characters. I wasn't comfortable with the idea that, the character is somebody you either remember and then fictionalize. That is, you remember, you think you want to write about your uncle, but you change his name and you give him a mustache when he didn't have any. And then you pour in a sort of inner life to the uncle. Or if you don't fictionalize an existing figure, you then invent a figure part by part, bit by bit. Since I was not comfortable with any of those things, I had to think, why am I practicing this form, which I never thought I would sort of write novels. I thought I would write poetry. That was my first love. I think also, and I've written about this in an essay called Why I Write Novels. People also used to say, is this all true? Is there anything made up in it? It just seems to be from your life. And then I think, yeah, I am writing about my life, but I'm writing about the bits in my life, or maybe not. I'm not always writing about my life. I'm often writing about my life, but the bits in my life in which nothing has happened or nothing happens. So if I were a memoirist, then I should be writing about the important bits in my life. but I'm writing about the most unimportant bits in my life. So what kind of memoirist am I? What is this novel where the unimportant bits, where I just happen to be there as a presence? It could be somebody else. It's just this me who happens to be present at that moment. I am important only in as much as I can be present in that at that moment. At that moment of seeming unimportance. So that kind of comes into the novel, that the kind of novel I do. Then I kind of seem to take, I grew up in Bombay. So in Friend of My Youth, I describe a writer called Amit Chaudhuri who goes back to Bombay to do a book reading. And yes, it's a book called The Immortals, and it is my fifth book as it is his fifth novel. And yet, I could have made that journey, and I could have made a journey very much like the one I described, but I never made that journey. So I am inventing the real bits in my life. But those real bits that I'm inventing aren't sensational in any way. I mean, I think one should take the trouble to invent one's life if one can invent it sensationally. But I'm not doing that. I'm inventing modes of kind of being which are banal and could have happened, but which open onto some kind of emotion and receptivity to the world. And so I think, yeah, it's not possible for me to do this in a memoir. It's not possible for me to do it in an essay. I must have that kind of structure of inventiveness, and I must invent some of the things that are happening to me, even if nothing is happening to me. And I must use dialogue. I must use he said and she said, and I must use the kind of joins that are peculiar to the novel. He looked out and saw. I mean, you don't have too many sentences like that in an essay or lines like that in a poem, but the novel is full of them. So I must have those joins. Must have those moments to create this kind of peculiar thing that I am creating. But in doing what I'm doing, I suppose I'm also talking about what the novel is not and what the novel should be according to conventional expectations. I'm implying by saying this is what I'm doing, and that this doesn't kind of fit in with the conventional expectation of the novel. And I think you can infer from what I'm saying you already know what the conventional expectation of a novel is, but I have landed up here at a crossroads as usual, or somewhere where I didn't expect to be, and this is my life. I didn't expect it to be, here, but this is where I am.
Yeah, I think that idea you're talking about, emotional truth, that sense of being present as you, but not necessarily writing about your life in a straightforward sense, has a kind of poetry to it. To me, that it feels like that often poets write about their life, but then do you see what I mean? There feels like there's a connection there, and I do also think that your language feels very beautiful and poetic across all of your work. And I wonder if whether you think that kind of language influences the length of the work that you write, because you've got quite a broad range. You've got some shorter novels and you've got some longer novels. I'm just thinking a shorter one like Afternoon Rug, and then a longer one like The Immortals. Do you have a sense when you begin of how long they're going to be, or does it happen as you write?
I have a vague sense, but I would say, I mean, and The Immortals, and there's another nonfiction book called Calcutta, 2 Years in the City. Those are I think my longest books, and they are long books are very unusual for me. I mean, I sort of tend towards the short novel. I have a vague sense of how long it's going to be but in terms of, a kind of unfolding space, not in terms of, um, uh, the scaffolding of plot, in terms of uh, of space. I would say I have a sense that I'm going to be wandering about and roaming about this kind of area, and sometimes the work is done before I thought, earlier than I thought it would be. By the work, I mean the work of roaming, the kind of area I want to explore. That work is done in a way that you know um, can be achieved in a shorter space. So I also guess I have a condition in that, I think I'll write 3 paragraphs on something and then I end up writing 3 sentences on it. The rest of it I jettison or I never write. I find I've written what I wanted to, um, in fewer words than I thought I originally would. It's some sort of recurrent condition, a chronic condition I've had through my writing life. And yeah, I also sort of take out a lot. The trick is not only to keep what's working for you, but how to make that work as a narrative, because you take, and and it's not even just that the sentences have to be well written. It's to do with what's alive, which sentences have some sort of future in terms of direction. The direction has nothing to do with plot. It's much more than that. But which sentences have a future in terms of what they suggest in terms of direction? And then how do we sort of make something out of this, make a paragraph, make a whole out of this, out of this kind of what of these sentences that you've kept because they seem to hold a promise of some kind, and that's the whole thing that then begins to happen, of how to make it move in some way from one place to another as a form. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds to me, I once heard you say that a sentence is a journey in itself. I think it was a BBC World Book Club thing I was listening to. And actually, you've sort of described that the sentences and the language is directing you kind of forwards rather than the plot. But as you're working to something longer, like The Immortals, did it feel like you needed something else to kind of sustain that longer form? Or what was driving you to make it sort of longer than some of the shorter ones, do you think?
I think each novel has a story and has a theme or has a kind of impulse that I'm investigating, or has multiple impulses or multiple levels of meaning that I'm investigating. With yeah, I mean, you have asked me about The Immortals. As far as The Immortals is concerned, well, The Immortals is about a young man called Nirmalya who who's sort of growing up, who's a teenager in Bombay, in very privileged circumstances in what's now called South Bombay. When I was growing up there, that was Bombay. Now Bombay has expanded so much, but that area is called South Bombay, and is kind of deemed the sort of the elite sort of part of Bombay, or the privileged part of Bombay. So that's where I was growing up. That's where Nirmal is as well. Nirmala is therefore sort of growing up in privilege, but he's unkempt. He's 16 years old or whatever. I can't remember his exact age now. He wears torn kurtas. He likes to pretend he's poor. And he suddenly gets drawn to Indian classical music. And his teacher is the same person who teaches his mother devotionals. And this teacher begins to slightly reluctantly teach him Indian classical music. Reluctant because, I mean, these maestros and virtuosos are very protective about what they know, in India at least. Or at least they used to be. And so he begins to teach him reluctantly. The teacher is so this was the tension and the comedy that I wanted to explore initially. The comedy was this, the tension was this, that the teacher thinks, why is this boy, why does he wear a torn kurta? Why does he wear kolhapuri chappals? Why is he going about like this? Why does he look morose and melancholy? He should be happy he's got so much. And the boy thinks, why is this teacher who's so talented singing the more popular forms of music and teaching the more popular forms of music to these talentless, rich women who live in these buildings? So the boy is a Puritan, and he is a devotee of art with almost religious conviction, the kind of religious conviction you might have when you're 16 years old, at least you used to at that time. And the older man is more ambivalent about life. The older man must lose out in the end, despite his pragmatism, because of the weakness of his class background. That's the other thing, that the teacher is not privileged. The teacher has a kind of power of knowledge, but comes from a background that is far less. I mean, it's not privileged at all, and so the teacher must lose out in the end. And the boy is trying to make sense of this relationship in which he seemed like the impoverished and lost one, but he will survive. He will go on to live life. The teacher will die, So there is a kind of comedy and an irony which I wanted to explore, which went right to the heart of life as far as I was concerned, and which also went towards addressing, and I did this in certain novels, from A New World to The Immortals and some of the stories in real time, to addressing a changed time in which, because of the onset of the free market, or as it's the 80s over here, the decade leading to the onset of the free market, where the artist's position had a new sort of ambiguity and precarity about it. What was the place of art in this new world that was emerging? And this new world has now completely emerged. This is the world in which we live in, and this is the world for some of us, this is the only world we know. So in A New World, my fourth novel, which came out in 2000, and in The Immortals, my fifth, which came out in 2009 after a long gap. I wanted to take a gap, a break from the novel. I began to sort of address this changed time that was around me then. where the market was becoming the one reality. And I was thinking, how does the artist on what terms do they exist in this particular changed world? Do they lie to others? Do they lie to themselves? In what way do they continue? And then what does somebody like Nirmala do, who seems to be more exacting in his sort of expectations, purer, almost asynchronous with that time, as if he belongs to some golden past. He thinks is where art can sort of exist spontaneously. It doesn't exist spontaneously anymore, but he seems to believe it does. I was exploring all of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could ask you in relation to the market in terms of many other things that you do with your artistic world. But I want to spin it back round to thinking about reader engagement and whether that's on your mind when you're working through these ideas and kind of exploring. In the sense you were talking about thinking about the market, thinking about art, and those differences in generational opinion on what that was and how that worked for the world, and whether or not you're thinking about how you're expressing that to the reader, or whether you're thinking purely about or more about your own kind of artistic expression of it.
I'm not really thinking of the reader very much.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of what it is. I'm thinking about what I'm trying to do. And what am I trying to do? And I'm trying to think, and I'm constantly reconsidering what I'm doing and thinking, what the hell am I up to over here? Because every work is based on impulses and principles that are both and stimuli that are both tenuous and profound. Sometimes they seem profound. Sometimes they seem completely tenuous. And so I'm writing, I'm working out what I'm doing. From time to time, questioning myself as to what I'm up to. So I mean, neither as a singer nor as a writer do I have much time to think. I would be doing an injustice to the reader or to the listener if I were thinking about them, because then I would freeze. I would deliver something for them which wouldn't please them. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've got so many questions here, but your answers have been so interesting, and I'm conscious that there are questions pouring in the chat. So I'm going to pass over to Emma now. If you thank you so much for saying all of that, Amit. And I know Emma's going to manage the questions. Thank you, Emma.
Hello, thank you so much, both of you, for that conversation. We've had questions teeming in from the chat. So I'm going to ask you first a question that comes from Anita Schwartz, who's one of our English literature PhD students. She's working on a PhD about texts in English written by women in India in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But her question for you relates to the city environment and interior spaces. And she's noticed that these are particularly important in some of your novels. She notices particularly furniture, objects, doors, windows that appear to be significant. So she wants to know, to what extent do you feel that these environments frame the experiences of the people who inhabit them?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Those objects and the life of objects is of great importance to me. And the novel, I think, as a genre that as a form, I've returned to it again and again because it accommodates this particular sort of field and this the possibility of including objects and their life in ways that may or may not be noticed and in ways which are not necessarily as in a naturalistic novel or in a realist, strictly speaking, in a narrow sense, realist novel. And details or objects are meant to sort of play a part in establishing the milieu of the character, or telling us something about their life, or the protagonist, or a part of the jigsaw puzzle, that the elements that add up to their life, and objects that kind of exceed, even while withholding, exceed that role are the objects that are of interest to me. The objects that kind of add up to the person's kind of backdrop or background or their life are of no interest to me at all. Sometimes they coincide, of course. The objects in a person's life are participating in that life, as I said earlier, without being aware of it. In a period film, the objects are all aware of participating in that period. In a film which approaches period and history in a different way, the objects are given an independence. They belong to that period, but they are not aware of belonging to any particular period. That's not to say they're universal. They are of that period, yet they are not of it. They have no awareness of existing in it in a way that an object in a historical novel, for instance, or film does. So I am interested in that kind of field of meaning, deeply interested. I love that section in Sontag's, Susan Sontag's essay on Walter Benjamin, when she's delineating the characteristics of the melancholic temperament. And she said the melancholic is more drawn to objects than to human beings. Now, there's a comedy to that, of course, as well. But, so maybe it's the melancholic in me. I don't know. I have no idea. Yeah.
Interesting. Dave Wakely is asking a question that I think might lead on quite nicely from that, in a sense. He's asking about the sensational you touched on earlier, as a means of showing the world as a reflection of each protagonist or narrator's normal. So what appears extraordinary or unusual to others can seem perfectly normal by the person who's having these thoughts or feelings. And he just wonders whether that is something that you're exploring in the novel form, and whether that might echo some ideas from Zen. So what is just what is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I like the way that he incorporates the word that I use to, describe what I was not doing, sensational, to describe, okay, this is another meaning for that word. Yes, this is sensational in a different sense, in that it involves sensation. But I said earlier that I'm seeming to give you things from my life, but not the sensational bits. As is the norm as far as memoirs are concerned, that they should be about something important, But that I'm not sort of giving you that important thing that you might expect from a confession about a life, but I am giving you the sensational in this sense, in the sense of the way we sense life, sense our way through life, the life that is taken in and participated in by the senses. And yes, that has the senses generally they can partake of life and consume it, but most of the time they're leaving life alone and just inhabiting life. You're not eating all the time. You're not eating everything or touching everything you smell or see. Most of our life is an intimacy with things without our interfering with them. And so that there is a capacity in that intimacy for us to become aware that we are partaking of life without necessarily interfering or intervening in it. So Zen, yes, I guess so, because I think those kind of philosophical Zen apparently is a corruption of dhyan from Sanskrit. Zen from Chan and Chan from Dhyan. And Dhyan means attention. It can mean attention in a very plebeian or practical sense. Pay attention to the child who's preparing for exams or doing a lesson. And in this other sense, which people like Simone Weil or Lawrence talked about, man is a thought is a man. Thought is a man in his wholeness, wholly attending. So in that sense, yes, Zen, I think Buddhism, all those philosophical traditions have played a very important part in reshaping modernism and reshaping modernity into this into this kind of discourse we call modernism, which really decenters our more conventional ways of thinking about how we feel and think.
It's interesting that you say about the more conventional ways we feel or think, because we have a question in the chat from Julian Crooks, who was picking up on something you said earlier about your own novels not fitting with conventional expectations of a novel. And he would just like you to expand a little bit more on that. He's asking, do you feel you have any kind of plot? Are you engaging the reader through characters' actions or tensions? Are you structuring scenes in a way that you're deliberately conforming or attempting to surprise readers' expectations?
There's no deliberate plan to sort of disappoint the readers' expectations. I sort of I mean, the fact that to me, probably they're normal novels, it's just that others have told me, I mean, even people who praise me, I mean, I saw an interview that there's this really well-known writer and critic called Paul Bailey. I don't know if you remember him.
I do.
He was saying nice things about Afternoon Rag, my second book, in an interview. He said, but it isn't a proper novel, is it? So I became aware. I became aware over time that this for some reason people didn't see it as a proper novel, and as to how I work, no, I definitely have a story which unfolds on various levels of meaning. To just give you one example, my latest novel, Sojourn, so I wanted to write about a man, in this case, is an Indian person like myself, who arrives in Berlin. But the fact that he's Indian is not of importance, really. Yeah, but the fact that he's Indian is also of importance in as much as he, like many others of that generation, is a product of the Cold War and its fallout and the end of the Cold War. So we're looking at a kind of person like me, for instance, who was kind of formed by the Cold War, in the sense that we thought that the world is always going to be the Soviet Union on one side and America on the other, and the non-aligned nations in between. Non-aligned, India was one of them. We are neither with the Soviets nor with the Americans. And this created the kind of field of meaning in our world. And I think it even gave Americans an important sense that even if they felt threatened by it, that there is an alternative. There is another world. The moment you feel that there is another world, then the idea of the alternative has a working life. The idea of the alternative in our present day situation, where the free market is the only reality we know, has the idea of the world alternative doesn't hold. So I wanted to look at this person who has emerged, like many others, into this world where the Cold War has ended. Now he's gone to Berlin, and he's feeling deeply absorbed by Berlin, although he's never been there before. He feels a sense of recognition. Now, this sense of recognition cannot be explained simply by colonial history, the way we are supposed to understand things. That if it's an Indian person, then they would feel some sort of sense of recognition with a place that has a kind of colonial sort of relationship with their past. No, that's modernity is a very different thing from colonial history and the way we've been taught colonial history, imperial history. Modernity is far more unexpected. The trajectory of the modern, as and when it emerged. So he goes to Berlin and he feels, I've been here before, and then he gets absorbed in the city. This absorption leads to a loss of himself and a loss of memory, because he begins to believe that, maybe he begins to believe he was always from that city. Now, it's through that trope, that conceit, that I wanted to unpick a lot of things, as I just said over here. So the novels will have things that I am looking at, that I want to sort of sort out and unpick, which energize the narrative as far as I'm concerned. But I can't do it like, he went to, Berlin, he was thinking about the fact that, the Cold War has ended, blah, blah, blah. Or, I can't do it in that sort of narrative voice. I can only work paragraph by independent paragraph. The paragraph partakes of the story, but is also unaware of it. Just like the objects I had talked about earlier. It exists in the moment, but it's also taking part in the story.
What you're talking about here feeds very nicely into our final question from the chat. So thinking about these wide issues of philosophy and politics and the environments that your characters are inhabiting, but also on a paragraph and sentence level, the process of writing about these issues or exploring these issues in writing. So Sue Reed wants to know, if your novel takes direction from your sentences, are you constantly editing and revising as you go rather than working through full drafts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't revise sentence by sentence. I mean, as I write a sentence, I mean, I don't go back to the sentence and begin to revise it. I do revise paragraph by paragraph, though. So I'll write a paragraph and then I'll read it again and I'll see that it's dreadful, and those are the moments that I was talking about earlier with Rebekah, when I think that, what am I up to over here? What am I doing? This is a disaster. Then I will start to look for the things in it which have some sort of future and life and promise. Then I'll try to make sense of the ways in which those bits survive. Yeah, that's I mean, the sentence has to have, like the paragraph, like the object that I mentioned earlier, the objects, the sentence has to have a life in the narrative. It should have a life outside the narrative. Should maybe be able to pluck it out of the narrative and read it, and it should still have some kind of a life. By that, I don't mean you should look at it and think, well, this is a very beautifully polished sentence. It's a very nicely written sentence. No, that's not what I mean. I mean, it should point towards various directions. Now, the direction it's going in the novel is only one of its directions. But if it is to work as a sentence, it should be able to exist independently. That independent existence is not to do with polish. It's not to do with how beautifully crafted it is. It's to do with whether it possesses a sense of direction independent of the one it has in the narrative.
That's an incredibly thought-provoking note on which to end, especially for those of us who are trying to create our own sentences with senses of direction. So on that note, I'm going to pass back to Rebekah.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you everybody in the chat for all your amazing questions. Amit, there's just so much one could continue to ask you, so it's a shame to have to bring this conversation to an end. But I do really want to thank everybody, the audience, the MK Lit Fest and the Open University for their work and support of the event. But of course, most importantly, I'd like to thank you, Amit, for being such a wonderfully stimulating and interesting guest. Thank you for staying up late into the night too, to talk to us. I wish you and everybody else a really good evening. And thank you all so much for being here. So thank you, Amit. Thank you, everyone.